Good afternoon. We are back here again for part 3 of this presentation on instructional objectives, chapter 5, and the final part of our presentation. We'll just get started here. So here we're going to start with our objectives. And this part of the presentation is going to talk about classifying our objectives. So we talked about defining the different learning domains and how that is used in the writing objectives. We've talked about the function of objectives and why they are important in the design process. We have talked about how to write goals in the various different write objectives in the various different domains. And now we're going to talk about classifying them. So we're going to learn about Merrill's performance matrix and using it to classify instructional objectives. We're going to analyze instructional objectives to determine the appropriate performance level and content type. And we're going to evaluate the role of instructional objectives in guiding instructional planning, assessment development, and instructional strategy selection, and then apply the instructional design process by connecting task analysis, objective classification, and instructional strategy development all into one nice little packaged bow. So classifying objectives is important for several different reasons. Objectives are usually used to help develop instructional strategies. However, objectives in and of themselves are usually difficult to use to develop those instructional strategies for two separate reasons. First, we talked about how sometimes those objectives are interrelated. So one objective might fall into more than one domain, and therefore it doesn't make it exclusive to one level of learning. Therefore, the instructional strategy may not be useful for handling both types of domains. And secondly, the taxonomies that are used within the domains are really not necessarily ideal for providing any kind of prescriptional instructional strategies. So for that reason, there's a matrix that can be used to help classify objectives. So we kind of talked about how all three of those domains really have some order of sequential hierarchy, starting from a lower level to a higher level. And that is kind of emphasized on this matrix as well. And the one proposed tool for classifying objectives that's highlighted in the text is Merrill's content matrix model. And it can help you determine which type of instructional strategy to use to master any given objectives. And it falls into, there's 6 categories. And as you see here on the left, the categories are fact, concepts, principles and rules, procedures, interpersonal, and attitude. And then when we talk about performance, we're talking about the recall or the application of those specific content. So if we look here on the right-hand side, fact is really just memorizing for recall. A concept category for which we can simplify the world. So kind of putting every category, every item into its own category to just kind of simply classify things into different categories, and then we developed a concept. So principles and rules express relationships between those concepts. So you can have a category of a, two-wheeled device as a bicycle, and then a category of a 4-wheel device or a 3-wheel device as a tricycle. And then those are two concepts of bicycle and tricycle. And then the principles and rules can really talk about that relationship between those concepts. So then we have procedure. So a sequence one would follow in order to achieve a goal. Interpersonal skills, so spoken or non-spoken interaction between 2 or more people. And then attitude is defined as the objective that seeks to change or modify a learner's attitude. And then we go on to the performance aspect of it, which we talk about recall. So the learner is required to just memorize and then later recall. So this is when we're talking about verbs of list, define, and name. And then the application, which requires the learners to use and apply the information. So demonstrate, discriminate, and solve. So when we're using this expanded performance matrix, the purpose of it is to help us develop instructional strategies. So how does it do that in particular? So typically, when you're dealing with objectives that deal with facts, we're talking some of the instructional strategies that you may use is memorization or flashcards or repetition. When we're talking about mastering concepts, we're talking about providing examples or vice versa, non-examples. So when we talk about that bike, we can classify other types of examples of bikes versus non-examples would be, four-wheel devices like cars. Principles were some instructional strategies helpful for mastering principal contents is case studies and problem-solving tasks. When we're talking about mastering procedures, it's best to do some form of demonstration and practice. Interpersonal skills, there's role playing is effective, and simulations are effective in mastering this type of content. And then attitudes, we're going to use reflection or discussion or modeling type activities to master this content. So if we look at it here, once again, going back to that car analogy, so we're taking all the facts and we're looking for the recall, to recall the speed limit in the school zone. When we're talking about concepts, we're talking about identifying the regulatory traffic signs. Principles, stating the principles of defensive driving. We're talking about procedures, is listing the steps of parallel parking. Interpersonal skills, we're talking about describing appropriate communication during a traffic stop. And then attitudes are explaining the importance of avoiding distracted driving. So then if you have now on this other side of the matrix that apply, so when we're talking about the facts, that recall, remember column differs from that apply, because now you're taking that speed limit and now you're determining the correct speed limit given the scenario. When we're talking about concepts, you identified the stop sign. Now you're going to classify the signs as either regulatory or warning or guide signs. When we're talking about the principles of defensive driving, now you're going to apply the principles of defensive driving in a traffic situation. We're going to talk about the procedures and listing the procedures of parallel parking, and then applying is actually the physical doing of the parallel parking. When we're talking about those interpersonal skills, describing the appropriate communication during a traffic stop versus demonstrating respectful communication with law enforcement. So the actual physical communication there. And then attitudes. So initially you would explain the importance of avoiding distracted driving versus now demonstrating a commitment to safe behavior. So, you would have an objective and you would take that objective and you can classify it here on this map in order to help you, depending on whether it's a fact or a concept or a principle, procedure, you can classify it on this matrix, and then it could help you prescribe the various instructional strategies that you might have access to. As well, understand what level of mastery you're in versus, the recall versus the application. So what are some of the pros and cons of writing objectives? So some of the pros are that they really clearly define to the learner what is expected of them. They really improve the instructional planning overall. Kind of a nice packaged bow of here's what you expect to learn, and here is the content, and here are some of the strategies that you can use to deliver the content. And then furthermore, which is this next one, it supports the development of instructional assessment. So given the fact that You've written an objective in a particular domain, at a particular hierarchy of mastery. It could really help you develop the appropriate assessment for the learner at that level. It helps learners focus on the important outcomes of the class. And really, it also promotes instructional consistency. So, consistent instruction time after time, every time you deliver this course, whether it's semester after semester, or if you have multiple cohorts in one semester, it really promotes that consistency. Some of the cons are that some of the outcomes that we work with are difficult to measure, particularly in that affective domain. Another con is it does require additional thought and effort about what exactly you're trying to teach and what level of mastery you expect from the students at that point. Overly specific objectives may limit the flexibility of what you are trying to deliver content-wise, which then leads into those higher level objectives may not be fully measurable. Not only in general fully measurable, but may not be measurable until later on, after some experience has occurred, or some time has occurred where now you can assess how the outcome was. And then finally, not all valuable learning can be fully captured in an objective because, like I said, some of these domains are dealing with attitudes and values and things of that nature, which you may not be able to fully capture everything that you learned within that instructional session. So some of the key takeaways from all three of these presentations is that instructional objectives play a key role in the process of instructional planning. So it indicates what is expected of the learner. It helps guide planning the instructional material and devising tests and competencies, so your assessments. And when we're talking about instructional objectives, there's some interchangeable language that's typically used. Behavioral, cognitive, instructional, learning, educational, and performance objectives are typically a little bit interchangeable there. Objectives are grouped into three domains: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. And really all of them to a certain extent are there's a sequential hierarchy, and all three of them are interrelated. And one of the final takeaways is that objects are organized and sequenced by very different methods or schemas. And the one that we covered particular in here is Merrill's performance contact matrix. And what that does is it ensures more advanced objectives. It ensures that the most advanced objectives receive more suitable attention, and they also aid in prescribing the appropriate instructional strategies for delivering the content. So if we kind of go back a little bit now here and look at the whole instructional design process that we talked about, and kind of putting it all together. So we start up at the top with that task analysis, so determining what needs to be taught. Then developing that instructional objective using all of the information that we learned today, using the domains and the hierarchies, and learning how to write goal objectives for different domains, and then classifying those domains, because those classifications can then help us develop our instructional strategies. And then from there, we have some additional analysis. And like I said, that objective writing process is usually not just a one-step process. It's fluid. You might have to go back and tweak and change and modify or alter, or maybe you forgot something and just kind of reword. And it's just this ongoing process as you continue to develop and progress and advance that instructional design process. If you have any questions, please email me, but you will have a quiz at the end of this that is on activity number 3. Thank you.